She didn't scream when the rope snapped, just watched, eyes like burned cotton, hands trembling at her sides. The morning air was thin and sharp, tasting of frost and the sour sweat of the crowd. It clung to the raw timber of the gallows, a scaffold erected in the gray heart of Oakhaven's Market Square. Malric Vaughan felt the air, too. He felt it on his neck, in his lungs, a familiar chill that had nothing to do with the season. He was a man made of such mornings. He stood on the platform, a little to the side, his work already done. The knot was a thing of precision, a brutal sort of art he'd perfected over 2 decades. The hangman's knot, they called it. A sailor's hitch twisted into a final, grim purpose. 13 coils, snug beneath the left ear. He'd measured the man's weight with his eyes, calculated the drop to the inch. Enough to sever the spine, not the head. A clean death, if such a thing could be said to exist at the end of a rope. That was his trade. Not justice, not vengeance, just the clean, quiet mechanics of an ending. He never asked their names. It was a rule, the first and most important one. A name was a story, a life. He dealt only in bodies, in weight and measure. The man who had just fallen had been broad-shouldered, with the calloused hands of a quarryman. He'd been convicted of treason, of smuggling secrets to the northern baronies, or so the magistrate's proclamation had read. Malric hadn't listened too closely. The crime was immaterial. The sentence was all that mattered. The man had not wept or pleaded. He'd walked to the noose with a straight back, his gaze fixed not on the heavens, nor on the stern face of Magistrate Boren, but on a point in the crowd. A small, still point. The girl. Malric had noticed her when he'd led the condemned up the steps. She was a splinter of stillness in a sea of murmuring, shifting townsfolk. Perhaps 10 years old, maybe 12. Her hair was the color of wet straw, pulled back in a severe braid. Her dress was patched but clean, the same muted gray as the sky. She stood alone, a few feet ahead of the press of bodies, as if an invisible circle had been drawn around her. It was to her the quarryman had looked, a final silent message passing between them. He had not smiled, had not mouthed a word. He had simply looked, and she had looked back. Now his body hung in the liminal space between the platform and the ground, turning slowly on the rope. A collective sigh, a shudder, passed through the crowd. It was the sound of morbid satisfaction, of fear placated, of a dark duty witnessed. They would talk about it for days in the Gilded Griffon, over mugs of thin ale. They would tell their children to behave, lest they end up on Malric Vaughan's platform. The Hangman. A name to frighten children and chasten men. He waited. His job was not quite finished. He had to wait for the twitching to cease, for the life to fully drain away, for the body to become mere cargo. He kept his eyes on the rope, on the strain of the hemp, but his awareness was tethered to the girl. She had not moved. Her gaze had not faltered. It remained fixed on the hanging man, on the father she did not scream for. Her hands, he saw, were no longer trembling. They were clenched into small, white-knuckled fists at her sides. Her face was a mask of placid shock, her eyes wide and dry, as if all the tears she would ever shed had evaporated before they could form. The crowd began to break apart. The spectacle was over. The sun, a weak, buttery smear on the horizon, was beginning to climb, promising a day like any other. Shopkeepers returned to their stores, mothers pulled their wide-eyed children close and hurried them away. The murmuring faded into the clatter of wagon wheels on cobblestone, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer. Soon, only a few remained. Magistrate Boren, looking self-important and slightly queasy, 2 guards, their faces impassive, the town undertaker, a man named Fendrel, who was approaching the gallows with a proprietary air, his measuring tape already in hand, and the girl. Malric pulled a long-bladed knife from a sheath on his belt. The steel was cold and sharp. He stepped toward the body, positioning himself to cut the rope. Fendrel cleared his throat. "A good drop, Voan. Clean as you please." Malric grunted in reply, not looking at him. He didn't want praise. He wanted the silence that came after, the solitude of his cabin in the woods, miles from the judgment and the whispers of Oakhaven. He sliced through the thick rope with a single practiced motion. The body fell the last few feet with a heavy thud, landing on the dusty canvas Fendrel had spread below. The sound was obscene in the quiet square. The girl flinched. It was the first real movement he had seen from her, a sharp, involuntary jerk, as if the sound had struck her a physical blow. But still, she made no sound. Fendrel and his lanky apprentice began their grim work, wrapping the body in the canvas. Magistrate Boren gave a curt nod in Malric's direction. "Your payment will be at the bursar's office, Voan, as arranged." Malric nodded back, his eyes still on the girl. The magistrate followed his gaze, his lips thinning in disapproval. Tragic business, the sins of the father. Still, the law is the law. He turned and walked away, his robes swishing behind him, leaving the hangman, the undertaker, and the orphan alone in the square. Fendrel's apprentice, a nervous boy named Pip, kept glancing at the girl, his face pale. Fendrel, however, was all business. "Right, get the legs, boy. He's heavier than he looks." They heaved the shrouded body onto a waiting handcart. Fendrel paused, wiping his hands on his apron, and looked at Malric. "What about her?" he asked, his voice low. "She's not my concern," Malric said. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. Fendrel shrugged. "Someone from the parish will come for her, I suppose. Or not. Quarrymen didn't have much in the way of friends." He and Pip began to wheel the cart away, the single wheel squeaking a miserable complaint against the stones. And then there were two. The sun was higher now, casting long, distorted shadows from the gallows. The shadow of the empty noose, still dangling, danced near the girl's feet. She stood in the center of the square, a statue carved from grief. The whole town had emptied itself, leaving her in the vacuum. Malric coiled the cut rope, his hands moving with an old, familiar rhythm. It was good hemp. He could splice it, use it for something else. He never reused a hanging rope for another hanging, but it was useful for other things. He tucked it into his satchel. He should leave. He should go to the bursar, collect his silver, buy flour and salt, and walk the 3 miles back to his cabin. He should forget the girl with the burned cotton eyes. But he couldn't move. He was anchored by her stillness. It was louder than any scream, heavier than any weeping. It was an accusation of a kind he had never faced. He was the town's necessary monster, the functionary of its final justice. He was accustomed to fear, to revulsion, to a wide berth being granted wherever he walked. He was not accustomed to this profound, silent witness. He walked toward her. His boots made dull sounds on the cobblestones, each step closing the distance she had so carefully maintained. She didn't retreat. She didn't look at him. Her eyes remained on the spot where her father's body had fallen, as if she could still see the impression of him in the dust. He stopped a few feet from her. He was a large man, his shoulders broad from the physical demands of his work and the solitude of felling his own timber. He must have cast a terrifying shadow over her. He smelled of rope and steel and the cold morning air. "You should go home," he said. His voice was rough, unused to softness. She said nothing. Her jaw was set, a line of stubbornness in her pale face. "There's nothing left to see," he tried again, more gently this time. Her gaze flickered then, not to his face, but to his hands. The hands that had checked the knot, the hands that had pulled the bolt, the hands that had cut the rope. She stared at them, and he felt a sudden, bizarre urge to hide them behind his back, like a child caught stealing. He waited. The silence stretched, becoming a physical thing between them, a wall of her making. He could just walk away. It was not his responsibility. He was the hangman. He did the deed and was done. But the image of her standing alone in this empty square under the shadow of the gallows was a thing he knew would follow him back to his cabin. It would sit by his fire. It would lie in the empty space on the other side of his bed. The law is the law, the magistrate had said. But the law had made no provision for this. A girl made of stone and silence. An orphan of his own making. With a sigh that seemed to pull up something from the very foundations of his soul, Malric Vaughan crouched down. He was not a gentleman. He did not know how to be. His movements were practical, efficient. He reached out, not for her hand, but slid one arm behind her back and the other under her knees. He expected her to fight, to scream, to finally break her silence with a curse. She did none of those things. She was shockingly light, a bundle of twigs and worn fabric. As he lifted her, her body remained rigid for a moment, and then a subtle, almost imperceptible shift. A surrender. Her head lolled against his shoulder, her face turned away from him, hidden in the coarse wool of his coat. She was not clinging to him. She was simply allowing herself to be carried. He stood up, holding the child of the man he had just executed. He looked around the empty square, at the shuttered windows and closed doors. He felt their judgment, a cold pressure from all sides. Before, they had looked at him with fear. Now, he imagined, they would look at him with a new kind of horror. The hangman and his prize. He didn't go toward the bursar's office. He turned his back on the gallows and began the long walk out of Oakhaven, the silent girl in his arms, her slight weight a heavier burden than any body he had ever cut down from the rope. The path to his cabin was not a road, but a track worn into the earth by his own solitary passage. It wound through the whispering woods, a place most townsfolk avoided. They said it was haunted by the spirits of the men who had died on the gallows, their souls unable to cross the Scorn River. Malric didn't believe in ghosts, but he appreciated the privacy they afforded him. The girl in his arms was as quiet as the trees. She had not stirred, had not made a sound since he'd picked her up. He'd half expected her to fall asleep, the way a small child might, but he could feel the tension in her small frame. She was awake, aware, a conscious weight against his chest. He tried to hold her in a way that might be comfortable, but he didn't know how. All his strength was for pulling, lifting, cutting. The act of cradling was foreign, clumsy. His cabin came into view through a thinning of the pines. It was a simple, sturdy structure he had built himself from the timber of the woods. A stone chimney breathed a thin plume of pale smoke from the embers he'd banked that morning. There was a woodshed, a small, well-tended garden where he grew potatoes and hardy greens, and a long workbench under a lean-to, littered with woodworking tools and coils of new rope. It was a place of solitude, of order. A place utterly unsuited for a child. He pushed the door open with his foot. The single room inside was sparse and clean. A narrow bed covered with a wolf pelt, a stone hearth, a heavy wooden table, and 2 chairs. Shelves on the wall held a few books, dishes and jars of dried herbs. It smelled of pine, wood smoke, and something else. Loneliness. A smell he'd never noticed before. He walked to the hearth and gently set her down in one of the chairs. It was too big for her. Her feet dangled a good 6 inches from the floor. She immediately wrapped her arms around herself, as if trying to shrink, to take up as little space as possible. She stared into the glowing embers of the fire, her face illuminated by their soft orange light. The burned cotton look was still in her eyes, but now they reflected the dying flames. Malric didn't know what to do next. He was the hangman. His interactions with people were brutally defined, scripted by law and ritual. There was no script for this. He moved about the cabin, his actions suddenly loud and graceless in the charged silence. He added logs to the fire, the crackle and spit of the wood filling the room. He pumped water into a kettle and set it on the hook over the flames. He took out a loaf of dark bread and a hunk of cheese. He cut a slice of bread, smaller than his own, and put it on a wooden plate with a piece of cheese. He set it on the table in front of her. "You should eat," he said. She didn't look at it. Her gaze remained fixed on the fire. He sat down in the other chair, the table between them a vast empty expanse. He ate his own bread and cheese, the familiar food tasting strange in his mouth. He watched her, this small, silent creature he had brought into his sanctuary. Why had he done it? It wasn't pity. He didn't think he was capable of pity. It was something else, a sense of wrongness. The clean mechanics of the execution had been fouled by her presence. Her stillness had broken the ritual, had forced him to see the frayed end of the rope, the life that unraveled from it. He had taken her not to save her, but perhaps to contain the consequence, to keep the ghost of his deed where he could see it. The hours passed. The sun moved across the sky, its light slanting through the single window of the cabin, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The kettle boiled. He made a mug of weak, sweet tea and placed it beside her plate. The steam rose in a fragrant cloud, but she gave no sign she noticed. Night fell. He lit an oil lamp, its yellow glow pushing back the shadows but making them deeper in the corners of the room. He ate a stew of potatoes and salted meat from a bowl, his spoon scraping against the wood. The sound was deafening. She had not moved from the chair. She had not eaten, not drunk, not spoken. He couldn't leave her there all night. He took the wolf pelt from his own bed and walked over to her. He draped it around her small, stiff shoulders. The fur was thick and warm. She flinched at his touch, a small, sharp intake of breath, but didn't pull away. "You can sleep here," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I'll take the floor." He laid out a few rough blankets for himself near the hearth, far enough away to give her space, but close enough to keep the fire going through the night. He lay down, fully clothed, and stared at the ceiling beams, at the patterns of shadow and light. He could hear her breathing, a shallow, even rhythm in the quiet room. It was the first time in 15 years that another person's breath had shared his sleeping space. He did not sleep. He lay awake, listening to the fire, listening to her silence, and felt the foundations of his solitary world begin to crack. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun. He established a routine born of desperation. He would rise, tend the fire, prepare food he knew she wouldn't eat, and then retreat to his work. He chopped wood, his axe splitting logs with sharp, angry reports. He repaired a chair, planed a new set of shelves, his tools shaping the wood with a precision he could no longer feel in himself. All the while, he was aware of her. She remained in the chair by the fire, a silent sentinel. Sometimes she would move to the window, staring out into the woods for hours. She never looked at him. He began talking to her, or rather, at her. He described the woods, the names of the trees. "That's a silver birch. The bark peels like paper." He explained how he set his snares for rabbits, the way the wind carried a scent. He spoke of practical things, of the world outside the window, hoping a word, a sound, might find a crack in her wall of silence. She offered nothing in return. She was a well, and his words were stones he dropped into her depths, never hearing them land. One afternoon, about a week after he'd brought her there, he was cleaning out a small storage chest. At the bottom, beneath some old leather scraps, he found a bundle of charcoal sticks he used for marking timber and a sheaf of rough, cheap paper. On an impulse, he took them to the table and set them down near her. "Here," he said, "if you want them." He went outside to split kindling, expecting to find the items untouched when he returned. When he came back in, his arms full of wood, he stopped in the doorway. She was at the table, a stick of charcoal clutched in her small fist. She was drawing. He put the wood down quietly and watched from a distance. Her hand moved with a strange, jerky intensity. She was not sketching idly. There was a purpose to her marks, a fury in the way she pressed the charcoal to the paper. He could not see what she was drawing. He only saw the fierce concentration on her face, the dark smudges of charcoal that already stained her fingers and cheek. He left her to it. For the first time since she'd arrived, she was engaged in an act of her own volition. It was a beginning. Of what, he did not know. Later that evening, after she had returned to her chair by the fire, he went to the table. There were several sheets of paper there, covered in black. He picked up the top one. His breath caught in his throat. It was a drawing of the gallows. Not a child's simple rendering, but a thing of stark, brutal detail. She had captured the texture of the wood, the angle of the crossbeam, the menacing shape of it against a blank sky. The next sheet was a rope. 13 coils, drawn with obsessive precision. The next was a pair of boots, dangling in empty space. The next, a crowd of faces, their mouths open, their eyes blank circles. He shuffled through them, his hands beginning to tremble. Each drawing was a piece of that morning, a fragment of the horror, seen through her eyes. And then he came to the last one. It was a drawing of a pair of hands, large, strong hands. One was holding a rope, the other was pulling a bolt. They were his hands. She had drawn them with an unnerving accuracy, from the thick knuckles to the scar that ran across his right thumb. He sat down heavily, the drawings spread before him like a judgment. She was not just processing her trauma, she was showing it to him. She was holding up a mirror, and in it, he was a monster assembled from parts, a gallows, a rope, a pair of hands. She had taken his mechanical, impersonal act and given it back to him, piece by agonizing piece. From that day on, she drew constantly. Her silence remained absolute, but the charcoal became her voice. She filled the cabin with her visions. She drew her father's face, not as he was on the platform, but smiling, his eyes crinkling at the corners. She drew a small house with smoke curling from the chimney. She drew herself, holding his hand. These drawings were her memory, the world that had been shattered. And then she would draw the shattering. The magistrate's stern face, the guards' impassive helmets, and always, always, the tools of Malric's trade. He would find them left for him on the table, on his pillow, tucked into his book. A drawing of his knife, a drawing of the heavy ledger where the condemned men's weights were recorded, a drawing of his own face, seen from below, his expression grim and unreadable as he looked down from the platform. He began to feel like he was living inside her nightmare. His cabin was no longer a sanctuary. It was a gallery of his sins. The clean, orderly space was now haunted, not by a spirit, but by the tangible evidence of a life he had destroyed. He had to go to town for supplies. He'd put it off for as long as he could, but the flour was gone and the salt was running low. He dreaded it. He couldn't leave her alone, and he couldn't bear the thought of taking her with him. In the end, there was no choice. "I have to go to Oakhaven," he told her one morning. "You will come with me." She looked at him then, for the first time in weeks. Her gaze was not hostile, not fearful. It was flat, empty. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The walk to town was a torment. She walked beside him, her small legs struggling to keep up with his long stride, but she never complained. She just kept her head down, a small gray shadow at his side. When they entered the market square, a hush fell. It started with the woman at the vegetable stall, whose friendly chatter died on her lips. It spread like a contagion. People stopped. They stared. They had seen Malric Vaughan, the hangman, 100 times, but they had never seen him like this. The solitary, menacing figure was now accompanied by a ghost, the daughter of the man he had hanged. Whispers followed them like biting flies. "Look, it's her. Gods above, what has he done? He keeps her, like a trophy. Monster!" He felt the girl flinch beside him, her small body drawing in on itself. He wanted to tell them to stop, to shout that it wasn't what they thought, but what could he say? What was the truth? That he had taken her out of a moment of weakness, of guilt, that he was now trapped with her, a prisoner in his own home. It would sound like a lie. Even to him, it sounded like a lie. He went to the miller's, his face a mask of stone. The miller's wife, a woman who had always given him a wide, fearful berth but had served him civilly enough, refused to meet his eyes. She took his coins, her hand snatching back as if his skin were poison, and shoved the sack of flour at him. He saw her look at the girl with an expression of profound pity, a look that cut him more deeply than any overt hatred. He hoisted the sack to his shoulder and turned to leave. As they crossed the square, a group of boys emboldened by numbers blocked their path. The oldest, a lanky youth with a cruel mouth, pointed at the girl. "Is that your new apprentice, Hangman?" he sneered. "Gonna teach her how to tie a good knot?" Malric stopped. He felt a rage rising in him, hot and black, a rage he hadn't felt in years. He took a step forward, and the boys scrambled back, their bravado evaporating in the face of his cold fury. He said nothing. He just looked at them, and it was enough. They scattered like startled crows. He looked down at the girl. She was staring at the ground, her small hands clenched into fists. He saw a single tear trace a clean path through the charcoal dust on her cheek. It was the first tear he had seen her shed. It fell and hit the cobblestones, a tiny dark spot that was swallowed by the dust. They walked the rest of the way back in a silence that was heavier than ever before. When they reached the cabin, she went immediately to the table and began to draw. He didn't have to look to know what it would be. The leering face of the boy, the pointing finger, the pitying eyes of the miller's wife, the whispers made visible in charcoal. That night, he couldn't bear it anymore. The silence, the drawings, the memory of that tear. He sat at the table opposite her, the flickering lamplight between them. The latest drawing lay on the table, a picture of him, standing over her, his shadow swallowing her whole. "Why don't you scream?" he asked, his voice raw. "Why don't you curse me? Hit me? Do something. This silence." She didn't look up. Her charcoal stick kept moving, scratching against the paper. "I am a hangman," he said, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. "It is what I am. It is my work. The law demands it. A life for a life. An eye for an eye. That is the order of things. Without it, there is chaos." He was reciting the justifications he had built his life upon, the litany that kept him sane. But the words sounded hollow, pathetic. "I give them a quick death," he insisted, his voice rising. "I am more merciful than the blade, more merciful than the jail fever that takes men in the damp and the dark. I am a functionary, a tool of the crown. Do you understand? It is not my choice. It is my trade." He was desperate for her to understand, to see him as something other than the monster in her drawings. He needed to be seen, not as Malric Vaughan, Hangman, but as a man. "My father was a carpenter," he said, the admission startling him. He had not spoken of his father in 30 years. "He taught me how to use my hands, to measure, to cut, to join. He was a good man. He died in debt. The bailiffs took everything. My mother, she starved. I was a boy. I swore I would never be weak. I would never be at the mercy of others." He looked at his hands, the hands she had drawn. "This trade, it gives me a place. A fearsome place, but a place nonetheless. No one can touch me. No one can take from me. I am the one who holds the rope." He was panting, his confession laid bare in the small, quiet room. He had defended the indefensible. He had explained the inexplicable. He had shown her the pathetic, frightened boy inside the hangman. He waited for her response, for a scream, a sob, another drawing. The scratching of the charcoal stopped. Slowly, she raised her head. Her eyes, those burned cotton eyes, met his for the first time. They were not filled with hate. They were not empty. They held a profound, devastating clarity. She opened her mouth, and her voice, when it came, was not a child's voice. It was small and clear and sharp as a shard of ice. It cut through all his justifications, all his pathetic reasoning, all the walls he had built around his soul. She spoke only 4 words. What was his name? The question fell into the silence of the cabin and shattered it forever. His name. The one thing he never asked. The one thing he had built his entire sanity on not knowing. The man had been a weight, a measure, a crime on a proclamation. He had not been a person. He had not been a name. Because a name was a father. A name was a life. A name was the smiling man in her drawings. Malric Vaughan stared at her. He had no answer. He could not remember. He had deliberately, meticulously not known. And in that moment, he understood that his careful, mechanical detachment was not a strength, but the most profound weakness of all. His trade was not an act of order, but an act of erasure, and he was the one who was truly empty. He was undone. The girl's question echoed in the walls of his mind for days. What was his name? It was a simple query that had dismantled the entire architecture of his life. He could no longer see his tools, the ropes, the knives, the weights, as instruments of a trade. They were now artifacts of oblivion, tools for the unnaming of men. He looked at his hands and saw not the skilled appendages of a craftsman, but the agents of a profound and cowardly violence. He stopped working. The half-finished shelves gathered dust. The woodpile dwindled. He would sit for hours by the cold hearth, the girl's question replaying itself, each time stripping away another layer of his self-deception. He was not a functionary of the law. He was its most brutish expression. He was not providing order. He was merely sweeping the messy consequences of injustice out of sight. The girl, whom he had started to think of as Alara, though he did not know her name any more than he knew her father's, continued to draw. But her drawings changed. She no longer drew the gallows, or the rope, or his hands. She drew the woods outside the window, a bird on a branch, the pattern of frost on the glass, a single, perfect leaf. It was as if, having finally spoken and shattered him with her words, she was now free to see the world again, a world beyond her grief. He, however, was now trapped in the prison she had just escaped. One evening, there was a sharp knock at the door. Malric didn't move. Alara looked up from her drawing, her eyes wide. The knock came again, more insistent this time. It was the sound of authority. He knew who it would be before he opened the door. 2 of the magistrate's guards stood on his threshold, their helmets gleaming in the twilight. Behind them stood Magistrate Boren himself, his face a pinched mask of irritation. "Vaughan," Boren said, not waiting for an invitation. He stepped inside, his gaze sweeping the small cabin, lingering on the girl sitting at the table. His lips curled in distaste. "We have been expecting you in Oakhaven. There is work to be done." "I am not working," Malric said, his voice flat. Boren's eyebrows shot up. "You are the Crown's Hangman, Vaughan. It is not a position from which one simply resigns. There is a new sentence. A boy named Kalen, caught stealing grain from the Crown's storehouse. The sentence is to be carried out at dawn, 3 days from now." Kalen, a name, a boy, caught stealing grain. Malric felt a wave of nausea. He looked at Alara. She was watching the magistrate, her small face unreadable. "I will not do it," Malric said. Boren's face hardened. "Do not be a fool. This is your function. It is what you are paid for. What you are for." He gestured impatiently at Alara. "Has this situation addled your wits? Whatever strange penance you think you are performing here, it ends now. The law requires you." "The law? Malric repeated, the words tasting like poison. The law that hangs a boy for stealing grain to feed his family, perhaps? The same law that called that man, he nodded toward Alara, a traitor without ever asking his name. His name was Lyron, Alara said softly, not looking at anyone. She spoke the name into the room, and it hung in the air, solid and real. Lyron, a quarryman, a father. The magistrate flinched as if struck. He stared at the girl, then back at Malric, his face flushing with anger. This is insubordination, Voan. It is treason in its own right. You will perform your duty, or you will find yourself on the other side of the noose. Then find another hangman, Malric said. He felt a strange calm settle over him. The fear was gone. The carefully constructed identity was gone. There was nothing left to protect. There is no other hangman, Boren snapped. You are the only one in this province with the skill. Do you want me to have some ham-fisted guard butcher the boy? Strangle him slowly? Is that the mercy you wish on him? The magistrate's words were meant to be a threat, a manipulation. But they sparked something else in Malric. He looked at his own collection of ropes, hanging neatly on pegs on the wall. He walked over to one of them. It was a long coil of fresh, pale hemp, perfectly balanced. He had spent a week braiding it. It was the one he had saved for himself, for the day when the work became too much, or his hands began to shake, his own clean, quiet ending. He took the rope down from the peg. It felt heavy in his hands, full of a terrible potential. He looked at Magistrate Boren, whose eyes widened slightly, thinking perhaps that Malric had come to his senses, or worse, that he had gone mad. Malric didn't look at the magistrate for long. He looked at Alara. Her eyes were on the rope. She knew what it was for. He could see it in her gaze. She had likely drawn it a dozen times. He turned back to the magistrate. I will come to the jail, he said slowly, the night before the execution, to prepare the prisoner. Boren relaxed, a smug smile touching his lips. He thought he had won. Excellent. I knew you would see reason. The crown is not ungrateful for loyalty, Voan. Remember that. He gave Alara one last look of contempt, then turned and swept out of the cabin, his guards falling in behind him. The door closed, leaving Malric and Alara alone again. The rope was still in his hands. He didn't hang it back on the peg. He laid it carefully on the table, the coil a pale snake on the dark wood. Alara looked from the rope to his face. He saw no judgment in her eyes now, only a quiet, watchful understanding. He had been undone by her question, and now he was being remade by it. He finally knew the price of a name, and he knew, with an absolute certainty born of his own ruin, that he could not take another one. The night before the scheduled execution was thick with a damp chill that promised a miserable dawn. Malric walked through the empty streets of Oakhaven, the coiled rope slung over his shoulder. The town was asleep, dreaming its righteous dreams, while in the stone jail beside the magistrate's hall, a boy named Kalen was counting his last hours. The jailer, a squat man with a perpetually sour expression, let him in without a word. He knew Malric, knew his purpose on these nights. He led him down a flight of damp stone steps into the belly of the building. The air was cold and smelled of mildew and despair. He's in the end cell, the jailer grunted, gesturing with a ring of keys. The magistrate said to give you what you need. I need to be alone with the prisoner, Malric said. To take his measure, to speak with him. It ensures a calm transition. The jailer shrugged. It was an unusual request, but Voan was the hangman. His methods were his own. He unlocked the heavy iron-barred door of the last cell and swung it open with a groan of protest. Don't take all night. I want to get some sleep before the festivities. He trudged back up the stairs, his footsteps echoing until they were gone. Malric stepped into the cell. It was little more than a stone box. A thin straw pallet lay in one corner. On it sat a boy who couldn't have been more than 17, all sharp angles and hollow cheeks. He looked up as Malric entered, his eyes wide with terror. This was Kalen. "Are you—" the boy whispered, his voice cracking. "I am," Malric said. He unslung the rope from his shoulder and laid it on the floor between them. The boy flinched, staring at the noose at its end as if it were a live serpent. Malric sat down on the floor, leaning his back against the cold stone wall. He did not approach the boy. He did not act the part of the executioner. "You stole grain," Malric said. It was not a question. The boy nodded, unable to speak, his eyes still fixed on the rope. "Why?" A tear escaped the boy's eye and traced a path through the grime on his cheek. "My sister," he croaked. "She has the lung fever. She needs food to have any strength. The apothecary's remedies are useless without a full belly." Malric closed his eyes. He saw Ilara's face. He heard her voice. What was his name? Lyran. Kalen. The names were a litany of the law's brutal simplicity. "When they take you to the platform tomorrow," Malric said, his voice quiet and even, "the crowd will watch. The magistrate will read your sentence. They will say justice is being done." He paused, then opened his eyes and looked directly at the boy. "It is not justice. It is a convenience. It is the easy answer to a hard question." Kalen stared at him, his fear slowly being replaced by confusion. This was not the conversation he had expected to have with his executioner. Malric reached out and picked up the rope. Not the noose, but the long, smooth length of it, the rope he had made for himself. "I spent my life believing in the mechanics of my work," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "In the clean drop, I told myself it was a mercy, but the mercy of the rope is a lie. The only true mercy is a choice." He stood up and walked to the cell door. He looked up and down the empty corridor. The jailer was gone, likely asleep in his chair upstairs, confident his prisoner was secure. Malric turned back to Kalen. He held out the rope. The boy recoiled. "No," Malric said. "Not for that." He gestured to the cell's single high window. It was barely a slit in the stone, barred and formidable. "The bars are old. The mortar is crumbling. A strong man could work one loose in time." He looked at his own hands. "Or with the right tool." He walked over to the wall beneath the window. He began to uncoil the rope, tying one end securely around the lowest bar. He then looped the other end, creating a series of footholds. Kalen watched, his mouth agape. "What are you doing?" "The jailer makes his rounds at the hour. He is lazy and predictable. You have until then," Malric said, testing the knots. "The Scorn River is a mile east of here. Follow it north. The woods are deep. A boy with reason to run can disappear." He finished his work. The rope ladder was crude but strong. It reached halfway up the wall. A strong, desperate youth could use it to get a purchase, to climb to the window. "The bar at the top," Malric said, pointing. "It's the loosest. Use this." He reached into his coat and pulled out the long, sharp knife he used for cutting the hanging rope. He laid it on the straw pallet. The boy was on his feet now, trembling not with fear, but with a wild, disbelieving hope. "But they will know it was you. They will hang you for this." Malric looked at the noose, still lying on the floor, a relic of a future he had just discarded. "I have been hanging for a long time," he said. He picked it up. This was the noose he had saved for himself, the symbol of his own final judgment. He held it out to the boy. Kalen shrank back. "Take it," Malric said, not as a threat, as a reminder. This was meant for a man who believed he had no choices left. "You have one. Do not waste it." Hesitantly, Kalen reached out and took the noose. He held the heavy coiled knot in his hands, staring at it in awe and horror. "Go," Malric said. "Now." He walked to the cell door and pulled it shut. The lock had not engaged. He could walk out, slip away into the night himself, but he did not. He sat down on the floor outside the cell, his back to the bars, and waited. He heard the sounds from within the cell, the scrape of the knife against stone, the grunts of effort, the groan of old metal. He did not know if the boy would succeed, but he had offered him the chance. He had given him back his name, and with it, a future, however uncertain. He thought of Ilara, alone in his cabin. He had left enough wood for a week, and the larder was full. A neighbor, a reclusive trapper he had traded with on occasion, had been paid and instructed to check on her, to see her safely to the next town, to a convent that took in orphans. He had written a letter, explaining nothing and everything, leaving her the cabin and all that was in it. It was a poor inheritance, a house haunted by her own drawings, but it was all he had to give. He closed his eyes, listening to the sounds of Kaylin's escape. He had spent a lifetime ending stories. Now he had started one, and in doing so, he had finally written his own last chapter. He did not know what the dawn would bring for him. The gallows, most likely. A new hangman, a clumsy one, just as Boren had threatened. But as he sat there on the cold stone floor, the echo of a girl's question in his ears, Malric Voan felt a strange sense of peace. He had offered the noose he had saved for himself to someone else. Not the death it promised, but the choice it had denied. He was no longer the hangman. He was just a man, and he was, at last, ready to be named.